Coming back to embodied cognition, you mentioned earlier, I'm really confused in this area. The sort of overlap between what embodied cognition says about generative linguistics. Do you mind just briefly sort of introducing that?
Sure. So embodied cognition is the claim that your understanding of, say, concepts is based not on some abstract representation, but it directly is based on the sum of your sensory and motor interactions with the relevant entities. So my understanding of this battle, I don't have this abstract symbol for a battle, but rather it's the sum of my experiences holding the battle, how cold it is and how round it is and how metallic it is. This is what counts as my understanding of the battle. Furthermore, when I perceive a battle, so in order for me to really retrieve this sum of experiences, I need to simulate what it would be for me to actually hold this. So to connect to the example of phonology that we used before, embodied cognition would tell you that your understanding of why blah is better. It's not some abstract rule, it's not this abstract representation, but rather you are trying to simulate, to enact what it would be for you to say blog. You do it silently, but you nonetheless go run this tape, so to speak. And it's this experience, embodied experience, that informs your, say, phonological intuitions in this case. So this is really an alternative to the representational theory of mind. What the cause of your, say, linguistic intuitions is not structured representation. It's not the structure of my representation of the word. Rather, it's the sensory and motor of experience of, in this case, producing this sound sequence. There is a little bit of a red herring there, actually a very big red herring there. So when you say cognition is embodied, obviously that sounds great. What would be the alternative? That cognition is disembodied, that you're a dualist, that if you believe in, say, abstract rules, then do you think that they do not form part of a body? Obviously, that's not the case. The alternative that, say, a generative linguist would suggest is not that knowledge of language is somewhere in the air, but it's in the brain, which is part of the body. So the debate here is not between an embodied view and some ethereal view, but rather two views of how information is represented in the body. One that claims that information is represented in terms of abstract symbols in the brain, and the other suggests that the brain mechanisms operate by simulating motor plans or say, sensory plans, and it's that constitutes your representation of reality.
So generative linguistics is still, well, embodied in the sense that your brain is part of your body.
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah, yeah, and that's problematic because oftentimes, that's a draw. So I want to make it clear. I do work in my lab that look very seriously at the notion of embodied cognition, and we do have evidence for embodied cognition. So I think that some of those claims are right in a very particular domain that I can explain later. So I have, nothing against embodied cognition. I do have something against the alternative that if you endorse the role of abstract rules, then you're a dualist, which is a claim that you often hear. I don't think that follows at all. So in particular, say what we do in the lab is show, so there's a huge literature, for example, it's a super interesting literature that shows that when you perceive a speech sound, I'll remain in the domain of language for a moment. When you perceive a speech sound such as ba, a sound that is produced by the lips, the motor area of the brain that controls the lip fires. When you hear a sound like ga, that's produced by the tongue, another area adjacent that controls the tongue, that area fires. So there is direct support, and furthermore, we know that if you stimulate those areas using transcranial magnetic stimulation, you're going to affect perception. So not only do we know that hearing a sound activates, simulates this motor plan, but rather the role of this motor plan is causal, that if you disrupt it, then you really disrupt perception. So there's very strong evidence that in the perception of speech sounds, people do rely on embodied cognition, just as the theory suggests. This, however, does not mean that all aspects of language are embodied. It does not demonstrate that, say, when you compute the sound sequence, you only rely on embodied cognition. And in fact, we have found, as I demonstrated, that when you disrupt the same lip motor area, you do nothing to the perception of syllable structure, for instance. So I think this is in line with the hypothesis that there are some low level of language, say, think about language as a Lego factory, right? What language is doing is constructing these beautiful towers out of discrete units using combinatorial rules. But before you do that, you need to get the Lego blocks, right? You need a Lego factory that gets that Lego units from the analog, continuous plastic stuff. That process is heavily embodied, and that process, when causally critically relies on the activity of the motor system. But at least based on the evidence that we have so far, it remains quite possible that there are other aspects of language that the combinatorial department of the Lego factory, this relies on abstract rules. So I think there is room for both, and I think there is a really interesting research program ahead to try to really define specifically what each of them does.
Right. So you think then embodied cognition can help explain what those Legos are,
and how they are extracted? Yes. The thing is that it's often the case in science that people like to have strong hypotheses, and they have a hypothesis and they want to push it as far as they can and to say, okay, I've shown evidence for embodied cognition in one area, the perception of speech sounds, therefore language is embodied as a whole. And I think the answer is more nuanced. I think that that very strong hypothesis is probably not correct.